Hi, so this video I'm going to talk about neoliberalism, class war, why we accept the shit hand dealt to us under neoliberal capitalism, and how the police militarisation thesis misses the point that the police and military often serve the same function. Ugh. Ugh. Gotta get my soy. This video first explores the concept of class war and pacification. I then move on to talk about how the imposition of neoliberalism in the UK should be viewed as a violent political revolution in which the state, the police and the media engaged in open warfare and pacification against the working class. Through this exploration, I show how the role of the police and the military aren't so conceptually distinct. Both are just arms of a larger process of imposing and protecting class dominance within a capitalist society. If you're a soy boy beta-cup like me, and you've spent a lot of time watching and reading Marxist propaganda from other soy boys, gals and MB pals, then you're probably familiar with the phrase class war, but I think it's useful here to pin down exactly what we mean by class war and how the process of pacifying a population to accept the capitalist order is a means through which this class war is waged. Class war can be conceptualised in a number of ways. For example, Marx, the original soy boy, it described capitalist society as civil war in its most terrible aspect, the war of labour against capital, and expresses class tensions such as the battle over the length of the working day as a part of a protracted and more or less concealed civil war between the capitalist class and the working class. What this reveals then is that Marx viewed capitalist society as producing certain conditions between the economic classes which produce different interests and different tensions. These tensions must then be mediated by power and force. But this can be extended beyond the internal relationships of factory production and onto larger processes of capital accumulation like imperialism and colonialism. Previous liberal thinkers like Adam Smith, who was... what's the opposite of a soy boy? Capitalist Chad? Anyway, Smith viewed the original accumulation of capital as being a natural process through which workers who had worked harder than others just sort of naturally accumulated more and more wealth. Through just pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, some people just very peacefully acquired all the land, wealth and other means of production.
This was the charter of the land, and guardian angels sang this strain.
But unfortunately for capitalist chads like Smith, capitalism isn't a natural state of affairs. It was dragged into being through violence and force by particular classes with particular interests. If we look to colonialism as a prime example then, this original accumulation took the form of separating indigenous populations from their land through violence and war, and then opening up this land to capitalist accumulation. So this process of original or primitive accumulation is clearly extremely violent. People weren't so much convinced to leave their land in the marketplace of ideas and more the marketplace of systemic violence. Violence, though, is not just present in this original state of capitalist accumulation, but is required for the maintenance and upkeep of the system itself. Marx sees this and argues that liberal capitalism can be viewed as the logic of war exercised in permanent fashion against rebellious slaves, antagonistic Indians, wayward workers, and criminals with something unsocial in mind. In both the case of workers fighting against capitalist exploitation and those oppressed through colonial accumulation, there must be a constant system, a constant state of violent enforcement to ensure that the balance of power always remains in favour of the capitalist class. This isn't done just through violent suppression, but also a process of pacification, whereby exploited peoples are made to accept the state of exploitation. This pacification process is done through military, police and propagandist means, like convincing everybody that this is a natural state of affairs, like gravity. What I'm getting at here is that in order for capitalist accumulation to exist, there not only needs to be a state of war, which opens up new areas to capitalist accumulation, but a state of pacification, which maintains this exploitation without the exploited peoples mounting any large-scale fightbacks. This is part of a single process, which has led to some scholars questioning the police militarisation hypothesis on the grounds that it separates the police from the military as conceptually distinct with distinct functions and purposes within a capitalist system, when in reality they both operate within the same social process of both generating oppression, as I talked about in my last video on police abolition, and producing social consent for the capitalist system. So, we're all on board with class war, right? We're all on board with class war, right? Now let's bring this closer to home and look at how the current dominant political ideology in the world today was implemented, specifically in the UK. I'm of course talking about Thatcher's neoliberal revolution. Now she was a capitalist Chad for definite. The reason I call it a revolution is twofold. Firstly, it represents a turning point in the political consensus from Keynesian social democracy to neoliberal capitalism. This wasn't just like a change of policy, but a process of transferring wealth and power from the hands of the working classes and into the hands of the capitalist class. It was a reversal of what was considered common sense for how a society should be run. Don't get me wrong here, I'm not saying Keynesianism was perfect and had wealth and power distributed equitably among the working classes. It didn't. It was also capitalism and was bad, but undeniably more power and wealth was held in the hands of workers during that period of capitalism. Secondly, to facilitate this transfer required a process of both violent war against the workers and pacification to maintain the neoliberal conditions once this war was won. This was a process of class warfare and pacification. The early years of Thatcher's reign were filled with instability and potential failure for the fledgling revolution. But it was in these early stages that the warpath was laid. The Tories roadmapped their route to neoliberalism using a document called the Ridley Report, which argued that to restructure British society into the neoliberal utopia required an all-out war with the unions, which were seen not only as a barrier to neoliberalism, but as a representation of the morally insidious nature and ideology of socialism. Thatcher didn't like socialism. It wasn't just an inefficient economic system, but actively evil. Thatcher and a number of her allies were a big fan of Chilean fascist dictator Pinochet. One Thatcher ally was a retired British general who described himself as an English Pinochet in waiting who wanted to do a military coup to destroy the unions if Thatcher failed. But yeah, socialism evil. With war in mind and riding a wave of patriotic popularity in the wake of winning the colonial Falklands War, Thatcher's government started her war with the unions, who were of course less soy boys and more soy men. Thatcher's destruction of mining and industry in the UK wasn't a question of cold economics, but one of pure ideology.
It's pure ideology.
And war is, I think, the right word here. In line with the Ridley Report, an army was made. The UK police force was altered to adapt to war, with an additional 15,000 police troops trained to help regional forces in clashes with striking miners. Police officers were armed with shields and visors and batons and began to look more and more like a paramilitary squad. On top of this, the police and MI5 were holding secret files on miners who were considered potential communists and subversives, a measure that one chief constable described as sensible. Arrested miners were interrogated about their political views, if they would vote Labour or Conservative, and police also began running snatch squads who would kick down the doors at the homes of striking miners and arrest them in their own homes for the crime of opposing Thatcher's revolution. Socialism evil. And this was of course done in the name of freedom, the freedom that the union miners were apparently opposing. The clearest single event during this whole saga, which illustrates the blurred line between the police and military in class war, was the Battle of Orgreave. This was essentially a pitched battle between striking miners and the riot gear clad, truncheon wielding police, many of whom were on cavalry back. Miners described nightmare scenes here, with police being said to use particularly brutal tactics to disperse them. This brutality has been linked to the police fully internalising Thatcher's characterisation of the miners as an enemy within, a subversive force which were fighting against the interests of Britain and needed to be destroyed in order to maintain Britain's democracy and law and order. But in reality, this was a conquest. And here we can see the blurring of that conceptual line between the police and the military again, because what difference is there really between the police function of putting down a rebellion internally and the military's function of quashing rebellions in foreign lands in a colonial context? Militaries are maybe more likely to be more brutal and violent, but if that's the case, that's really just a matter of scale rather than pure conceptualisation. And yet this isn't a matter of the police becoming more like the military, because as I talked about in my last video on police abolition, the police force in the UK was created with the specific aim to quash strikes in the labour movement. This was always the role of police in the capitalist system. But these pitched battles and arrests were just one part of an ideological process of class war to establish neoliberalism in the UK. It wasn't enough for the battle with the miners to be won, they should never be able to fight again. To achieve this, the Thatcher government and their friends in business began a process of starving out the miners. The government made changes to welfare which cut off striking miners from any recourse to cash that they could use to stop themselves from starving, while they and their friends in the business community started setting up suits so that they could seize the funds of the National Union of Miners, so that both the union and the miners themselves, as a sort of bastion of class power which could have stopped the neoliberal revolution, were broken for good. With this achieved, Thatcher had truly won this expression of class war, and her revolution could be continued unabated. As one of Thatcher's allies stated, they were on the brink of an even greater victory than the Falklands War, because the enemy within is so much harder to quell. They couldn't help but relate their colonial victory to their class one. Alongside this war was a process of pacification, of ensuring that this emergent neoliberal order was accepted by those upon whom it had been imposed. Much of this was done through a propaganda war. Thatcher's personal ethos for imposing neoliberalism was that there is no alternative. Like gravity telling the apple that down is the only way to go, Thatcher told the country that her ideology was simply a force of nature. And this allowed the government, the police and the right-wing press to frame this all-out class war as a matter of police holding up a sort of neutral kind of law and order.
You talk about the ruthless, manipulating few. Now, will you not negotiate with them ever?
I will never negotiate with people who use coercion and violence to achieve their objective. They are the enemies of democracy. They are not interested in the future of democracy. They are trying to kill democracy for their own purposes.
The media during these strikes consistently framed it using war imagery and metaphors, framing the police as the military defenders of the land against the miners as an almost invasive force, and definitely as a threat to democracy. The press didn't report on police attacks on picket lines. Television news took video sequences out of order to convey an entirely different narrative. And the government leaned on sympathetic media to portray a narrative that they were winning this war against the miners. It was a propaganda campaign with the goal to delegitimise the miners and thereby justify Thatcher's revolution as the right thing to do. This was pacification in action. But maybe the greatest piece of evidence that this pacification and acceptance of neoliberal ideology occurred wasn't the Thatcher government itself, but was the new Labour government of Tony Blair. The Labour Party was historically the political wing of the Labour movement, so you might expect that upon their landslide victory in 1997, they might work to redress some of the balance, shifting power from the capitalist class to the workers again, maybe repealing the anti-union laws and thoroughly rejecting Thatcher's neoliberal revolution.
No more bosses versus workers. We are on the same side, the same team, and Britain United will win.
Alas, Blair's government accepted neoliberalism and left much of Thatcher's anti-union legislation intact. Over the next 13 years of Labour governance, Thatcher's neoliberal revolution became embedded and institutionalised within the British state. Union density decreased, and while there's still some support for anti-neoliberal policies from the public, there's essentially no institutional avenue through which such a sentiment could be pursued. Even after the 2008 financial crisis, a direct result of Thatcher's neoliberal policies, neoliberal ideas didn't just hold on, but actively thrived and became even more deeply rooted within the British state. For the British state, neoliberalism was no longer a right-wing project, but was simply common sense, like gravity. And when Thatcher was asked in 2002 what her greatest achievement was, she replied, Tony Blair and New Labour. Pacification. It's pacification. So, class war and pacification are an essential feature of the capitalist system. In the colonial context, war and pacification are used to separate indigenous peoples from their land and open up that land to capitalist accumulation. In Thatcher's neoliberal revolution, the people weren't separated from their land, but workers were separated from the means through which they could express their class power, with the purpose to shift the balance of power in favour of capital. In other words, to further the goal of capital accumulation. This was achieved, and things like inequality in the UK have been steadily rising in the neoliberal age, with more and more wealth being held and concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. What might strike you when hearing about the media and government strategies to delegitimise the miners' strike is that much of the same rhetoric is now being used to delegitimise the Black Lives Matter movement and protests.
They flood the streets with angry young people who break things, and they hurt anyone who gets in the way. When they want something, they take it. The message is, force is more effective than voting. Elections change nothing. Rioting, by contrast, makes you rich and powerful.
Similar language of left-wing agitators, of anarchists and communists, of enemies and law and order is being trotted out by the right wing and the nominally left-wing news media. This is part of the capitalist class's war and pacification process. They'll wring their hands about protesters using violence and damaging property, while showing footage of streets looking like war zones, yet will happily legitimise the violence of the police and the violence of a system as a whole, while delegitimising anyone who stands up to it. What we should learn from the miners' strike then is that violence is not a problem for the state and capital. They will gladly use it to wage a war to destroy working class power. They will subvert and stretch ideals of liberty and democracy to impose a system which takes more and more wealth out of the hands of those at the bottom of society and funnels it right up to the hands of the people at the top. What this delegitimising campaign shows is that those with power and interests in the system see the protests as a threat. The reason that Thatcher so fervently went after the miners was precisely because they posed a threat to the order that she wanted to institute. The Black Lives Matter protests represent a similar threat, a threat that we will not be pacified, that capital hasn't yet won the class war. But then, what do I know? I'm just a far-left, postmodern, neo-Marxist soy boy. Well, thanks for watching. I don't know why I did this joke, it's not even that funny and it was fucking disgusting. But if you like this video, please make my pain worth it by liking, subscribing, leaving a comment and sharing it with a friend. If you want to become a patron, like my wonderful patrons Tamish Kispeter, Paul Singleton, Stephanie Beverley and Seamus Morrison, then please feel free to sign up. It's super appreciated and you can contribute to such stellar video making as this. Oof. As a $10 patron, Tamash asked me a question before this video, which was, why are some states able to ignore human rights law, like the UK not allowing prisoners to vote, while others have to sign up to derogation, which is mandated avoidance of human rights law under special circumstances like war or famine? The essence of my answer to this question is simple. Some states just have the power and legitimacy to ignore human rights law with impunity, and some don't. Often being unable to meet human rights standards is used as a pretense for Western intervention or wars of neocolonialism. But there's another point I would make related to the video. The attacks on the miners by police during the strikes could have been considered breaches of international human rights law, but there was no need for the UK to pretend that these human rights breaches were the result of extreme circumstances like war. In this sense, the police being viewed as conceptually distinct from the military allowed more wiggle room away from international scrutiny regarding police mistreatment of miners during the strike. If it had been the military that had been brought in to do the same job, there might well have been far more scrutiny on human rights grounds. I hope that answered your question, Tamash, and I hope I drank soy milk long enough to answer it in voiceover. If it looks like I did. Oh, what an idiot. Look at that. Jesus. Just stop drinking. I don't even like soy milk. Thanks for watching. See you next time when we're going to be talking about cultural amnesia and Scottish imperialism.